In 1992, the church apologized to a very famous scientist. The problem is, he'd been dead for 350 years. Galileo was born in 1564 in Florence, the same year as William Shakespeare. One very important thing that Galileo learned from his father was that a scholar has the right to publish ideas contrary to prevailing views. Also, that experimentation can lead to ingenious breakthroughs. Galileo first became famous for his observations and experiments on the pendulum that were inspired by the chandelier at his local church. A couple of years later, he proved Aristotle wrong by dropping 2 balls off the Tower of Pisa. Galileo said that the balls were made of the same material, so they would land on the ground at the same time, even though the balls weighed differently. Galileo was right. The first telescope was made in 1608 by Dutch store clerk Hans Lippershey. When Galileo first heard of the telescope, he immediately improved it by 3 times its regular viewing distance. His best telescope was 13 times better than the original telescope by Hans Lippershey. A year later, on August 21st, 1609, Galileo presented his telescope to Venetian lawmakers. They could see a ship with the telescope 2 hours earlier than with the naked eye. Galileo pointed out how this would help prevent enemies at sea and on land. Later that year, Galileo pointed his telescope to the sky and was amazed with what he observed. Through the telescope, Galileo discovered the craters and valleys on the supposedly perfect moon, millions of stars non-visible to the naked eye, the phases of Venus, and the Milky Way galaxy. He also discovered the moons of Jupiter, which he called the Medicean stars after his former student, who was now the Grand Duke of Tuscany. His former student's family was one of the most powerful families in Italy. So by naming heavenly bodies after Tuscan royalty, Galileo earned himself a spot as the chief mathematician and philosopher of the Tuscan court. The moons of Jupiter are known today as the Galilean moons. Galileo concluded through all of his observations and discoveries that the Copernican system of a sun-centered universe made a lot more sense than Aristotle and Ptolemy's system of an earth-centered universe. Galileo made his discoveries known by giving public lectures, teaching, and giving speeches. But one thing he was unpracticed at was being modest. He argued and argued and argued. Aristotelians viewed him as immodest and very belittling. Another thing they didn't like is that he talked as if everything he said was a known fact. Galileo had no clue what he was getting himself into. In 1613, Galileo felt the responsibility to defend his position after one of the most powerful women in Italy, Grand Duchess Christina, questioned a student of his. She thought that it seemed as if Galileo's ideas were contradictory to the Bible, even though Christina was a supporter and a patron of Galileo. The student immediately sent Galileo a letter informing him of the event. Galileo gave a quick and well-thought response. He said, "The Bible cannot err, and the decrees therein are absolutely true and inviolable. Though Scripture cannot err, its interpreters are liable to err in many ways, when using the literal meaning of the words." He continued, "For in this wise not only many contradictions would be apparent, but even grave heresies and blasphemies, since then it would be necessary to give God feet, eyes, and human and bodily emotions, such as anger, regret, hatred, and sometimes forgetfulness of things past, and ignorance of the future. Galileo became a little bit nervous because he knew the Church had the right to limit intellectual behavior if contradictory to Holy Scripture. Around 1610, Pope Urban V felt the responsibility to defend the Church. That was caused by the controversy over the Copernican system. So, 6 years later, 1616, 11 theologians came together by the request of Pope Urban V. They voted on two things. First, whether the Earth is not the center of the universe, nor is it immobile, but moves as a whole with a diurnal motion. And secondly, whether the sun is the center of the universe and consequently doesn't move around the Earth. It was unanimous. The Copernican system contradicted the Bible, so it was considered formally heretical and foolish and absurd in philosophy. Galileo had the responsibility to stay quiet. If he wasn't, he would have been most likely tried for heresy. There was so much fear of heresy because of Bruno's trial. Giordano Bruno was tried for heretical behavior around the Copernican system. His punishment was being burned at the stake. Galileo was quiet for 7 years. The Church thought that the Copernican system contradicted the Bible because of the book of Joshua. In the book, Joshua commands the sun to stop to give him more time. So, for the sun to stop, it must have been moving. Galileo argued against that. He said that Joshua was asking the sun to stop in the sky, which consequently was asking the earth to stop, because the earth is what causes the sun's path in the sky. Galileo also said that no truth in nature could contradict Holy Scripture, because God created nature. The problem was that the Bible can be interpreted in different ways. Galileo felt he had a responsibility as a scientist to tell the truth. He also felt the responsibility as a loyal Christian to discover how God created the universe. Galileo was put on trial in 1633 because of his book, The Dialogue of Two Chief World Systems. In his book, there are 3 characters: a Copernican believer, an Aristotelian, and somebody in the middle. By the end of the book, it is obvious that everybody is convinced that the Copernican system is correct. The book had sold out in a few months. Galileo's trial wasn't short. It took over a week to get Galileo to confess. His confession was caused by the torture devices at the table of the trial. Galileo was relieved when he heard of his punishment. His punishment was a life sentence of house arrest. Even after Galileo went blind, he continued to make observations. He did it with the help of his son. Galileo died in 1642. It took 350 years for the Church to apologize, but the Galileo Affair will have an everlasting effect on the future scientists' rights and responsibilities.